Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Trends webinar and Market Opportunities in 2023 and beyond. We'd like to welcome you to this webinar series today. Steve Kraus, Jon Last, and myself have been doing this for a number of years, so want to introduce these guys and then we'll get started. So Stephen Kraus is a professor at the University of San Francisco. Jon Last is president of the Sports and Leisure Research Group. And I'm Dan Fleetwood. I lead the research suite here at QuestionPro. So today we're excited to unveil the 2023 trends, and then also we'll take a look back at 2022. And then in addition, there will be some time for Q&A. So whatever platform you're viewing this on, put your questions inside of the comments, and we'll try to get to as many as possible today. So without further ado, Steve, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Jon, it's good to be on with you again. And this is kind of an extension of a long-running tradition for me. I've done this probably for about 10 years now, where we do this kind of outlook on the year to come. When I was a kid, New Year's was always my favorite holiday for some reason. And I really love the opportunity to think back and kind of process and make sense of the year that was, and think ahead and set goals and make New Year's resolutions. And that was just something that kind of spoke to me. It's actually a really ancient tradition. The ancient Romans used to do this. There's even some evidence the ancient Babylonians did it before them. But with ancient Rome, there was a lot of respect for the Roman god Janus, who had two faces, one that looked forward and one that looked back. And it was kind of really appropriate for this time of year. Janus was also the god of doorways and beginnings. And it's also where we get the name January. And so I always kind of took that to heart and really enjoyed looking back on the year that was and making sense of it. And like I said, setting goals and just trying to anticipate the year to come. So, if you go ahead to the next slide, it's kind of our kickoff, and that's going to be where we're headed. So let's take a quick look back at 2022. And, one of my favorite ways to take a look back at the year that was, actually, Jon, you introduced me to this. There's the media company Axios that every year looks back on using Google Trends data to understand what were the hot topics of the past year. And every year they kind of come up with a theme for how they characterize the year that was. And this year they decided that 2022 was a relentless year of upheaval. And I can see a lot to that. So what you see on that slide is really just the month of December. You can click through to that link and see the whole year. And it really just kind of underscores that we're just bombarded these days with new ideas and new media stories. And it's, every week it seems like there's the news story of the year. So I'm actually, if you go back and you look at the full list of everything on the Axios website, you start looking down and you realize, oh man, I had forgotten about that. Tom Brady had won a Super Bowl this year. Now we're so into the next Super Bowl, we don't even remember that. Ted Cruz, Rush Limbaugh, you can just go down the list of all the news stories that pop up, and it seems like it's the story of a generation, and then it fades away, and then there's a new story of a generation to come. So I think it creates kind of a sense of exhaustion almost among consumers. And I think as we look at our data, we're going to see that it really has been kind of a relentless year, a year of upheaval. And I think that's going to characterize a lot of the consumer trends that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, Stephen, I think you're correct, because even, the Winter Olympic Games, I forgot that was this year too. And then even, you see things like Pete Davidson in the news and so forth. Like, it's kind of interesting to take a look back at this. But one thing I was curious, Elmo, do you know why Elmo was trending?
I noticed that as the very first item on the list, and I don't remember that. Did they retire Elmo?
Yeah, I don't remember. So maybe if someone has
whether it was the Tickle Me Elmo toy, or that may have been like even further ago.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It does kind of feed into, like, I've used a term for a number of years, about how we've become this attention deficit society, and
Yeah.
this so speaks to it. I have a running, a kind of dark humor joke in my family about, like, if you're a celebrity, don't die in December or November, because then you only get remembered one time, whereas if you
No,
die
that's
in
true.
January or February, you get the replay at the end of the year.
You
But
know, I watch a lot of TikTok, which I'm not particularly proud of, but as someone who's kind of a trend watcher, that's one of the ways I sort of keep up on what are the hot trends. And the hot trends, the common memes, the themes of TikToks just change so quickly. Something will come up, and then it just seems like it's everywhere, and then a week later, it's something else that just seems like it's everywhere. And I think it really does create kind of a mental and emotional exhaustion among consumers in a way.
Yeah, and it plays. I mean, if we move to the next slide, one of the things that we track in we're now calling it the optimism barometer. It was originally the back to normal barometer, which we began really in response to the COVID pandemic. We are really kind of trying to look at people's perceptions and attitudes and how they will affect consumer behavior. And thought this would be an interesting one to kind of start with, to share with folks, and that is something we've been asking for a number of years about their optimism about the future of the country. And it's just kind of muddling along. And if you go back and look at the little, blue vertical lines, you can see that, on the one hand, we're a little better than we were a year ago, with 41% being very optimistic. That's what the numbers reference, and 37% a year ago. But it's also very much variant depending upon your vantage point. And I'll share with you in a couple of other slides. It suffices to say we've all learned and hear constantly about the divisiveness and perspective. So when you look at things from a politically ideological bent, you can see a real variance here in how people see it. But the good news, if there is a positive, and there are some nice silver linings to these clouds, so to speak, you do have a nice 14-point jump than what we saw a year ago in those that think the year ahead will be better than the year before was. So, if you're a half full person, as I tend to be, you take some of that optimism. If you're a little bit more skeptical and pragmatic, you're still thinking to the fact that, more than half the country is not optimistic. And that leads into another way that we look at this on the next slide, which is really kind of asking people about whether they feel the country is on the right track. That's a little different than what we just looked at. And this is another one of those that you can kind of take a full or empty perspective to. I mean, on the one hand, you have 35% that say we're on the right track. That's a pretty low number, but it is up substantially from where we were just a month ago. So, Steve, to your point about New Year's resolutions, and something we see in a lot of our attitudinal work in the golf industry, there's always this excitement and freshness that comes in with the new year. People are always, I just presented at the PGA show the other day, and people are always anticipating they're going to play a lot more golf in the year ahead. And then when you see the actual numbers, while it's actually been up the last couple of years, it's usually a lot more subdued than the expectations are at the beginning of the year. And that goes with, stress has kind of become part of our life. If you think about that, on the next slide, we have a component of the barometer that we call our stress meter. So there's two statements that we ask people to take a look at. And that is, how does your current stress level compare to a month ago? And what do you think your level of stress is going to be a month from now? And again, you can look at the last 12 months in succession. We seem to see stress really peak in the summer months, which if we can think back that far, it was a time where inflation was about at its peak, and we saw people really concerned about whether we were or weren't in recession. I'll share some slides about that a little bit later in our presentation today. And that's, it's abated slightly, but again, pretty consistent to where we were a year ago in terms of people's stress levels. So what are they stressing about? What are the issues that really have consumed the American public over the last year and into the new year? We'll take a look at it with these next couple of slides. Among some of the things that we've consistently tracked in our barometer are the components of public health, the economy, and crime. And we look at it in two different ways. We measure it both on a personalized level and then on a macro level. So the solid lines on these charts represent people's perspectives from the overall macro level, whereas the dotted lines are more how they affect people individually. And as you see this kind of peak and valley its way through the last few years, you can see that there's been as one would expect, there's been a big shift. You had the health related concerns back in 2020 and 21 kind of superseding the others. And now that, peak concern is more in the areas of the economy and crime, the green and red lines that you see that have kind of amassed towards early January. And then there's also a fairly large group of people that are concerned about geopolitical issues in terms of the threat of war. That hasn't gone away. Another way to look at this in a little bit more granular fashion is a table that we have on the next slide. And this is where we kind of take a look at concerns. We've got this going back several years, but again, I thought it would be interesting to just show you where we are at the current nanosecond. And that is, what are people thinking about? One of the things that I think is a positive, again, recognizing that this barometer began as a means to measure people's attitudes and anticipated behaviors within a COVID environment, you can see that the pandemic itself is on the bottom of the list. Only 37% in January, actually slightly up from 33% in December, feel that that's a very serious concern. So it is still inflation, it is crime, it is gun violence to some extent, it is government leadership. And if you kind of follow these to the right, it's varied, obviously, based on one's political ideology, and some of these differences are pretty dramatic, but depending upon what side of the aisle you align with. But really, as we've kind of thought about the big cloud hanging over everybody's head, while on the one hand, people are bursting out from COVID and certainly beginning to actualize and do the things that they've enjoyed to do, the question that really remains and hangs over people's heads is to what extent is the economy and our perceptions of the economy going to have on folks. So let's take a look on the next slide about where people sit right now in their thoughts on inflation, and a lot going on here. On a positive note, you can see that you have a much smaller percentage of people. It's a 10-point drop from December to January. The light blue section of these segment bars, these are the percentage of people that feel that right now prices for consumer goods are much higher now than they were pre-pandemic. The yellow bar segment represents those that say it's somewhat higher. Again, if you want to be a negative person, you can say that 2/3 are still feeling inflationary pressure. It's certainly not gone. But on the positive side, it has abated. 66% is substantially less than the mid 70s that we saw as you kind of work your way down these segmented bar charts and see where we were in the summertime and fourth quarter of this year. Another phenomenon on this slide that really is intriguing to me is, and we'll get into this a little bit further, is that certain discretionary purchases, certain leisure activities, certain areas that are really seen as want-to-haves versus must-haves have flown a little bit below the price insensitivity on consumer goods. So here you kind of look at travel. And yes, this is the people that are seeing where travel prices are much higher now in hotels and airfare specifically. It has gone up from where we were a year ago. That's not to be ignored. It has gradually increased, but it is still running significantly below what people construe for consumer goods. And again, I'll speak to that a little bit further later in our conversation about what may be driving that and what some of the dynamics are about leisure activities and travel. But to just close the loop on the economy, this next slide is also something that we look at with some regularity, and those are two statements. Steve, you can relate to this from the academic field, and I remember back in my graduate studies, I learned that the traditional economic definition of a recession was 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP, and there was all that talk in the summertime about are we in a recession, aren't we? Even though we had hit that technical definition, and I always like to try to answer the question by seeing what does the public feel, because so oftentimes people's perceptions drive the reality in terms of spending. So here are two statements that we've tracked in terms of people's budget consciousness, as well as whether they actually perceive us to be in recession. And again, you can see that the peak period of the summer months into the fourth quarter were when we saw people a little bit more cautious than they are now about either A, believing that we're in recession or that they are going to be more budget conscious. And then again, it's not to discount the fact that you still have an excess of 50% that are going to be a little bit more budget conscious. And I think the implication for marketers is really, how do you kind of position yourself as something that is that want to have versus that have to have, and kind of make yourself something that people are willing to kind of splurge on. Because indeed, we have seen some real shifts that seem to be enduring from the pandemic in terms of how people are really kind of, we call it the great reprioritization. And one thing that we see, if we move to the next slide, is how people have really kind of reprioritized their time. Again, I'll use an example from the golf business. Whenever you would ask somebody, what are the major inhibitors to playing more golf? The traditional responses were, it takes too much time, it costs too much money. Not very helpful, because you couldn't necessarily make people wealthier and you couldn't put more time in their day. But as you see on these particular metrics, what COVID has really done is it has helped us as a society to rearrange our time priorities and actually to give us more time. I'm not going to read these statements, but if you kind of go through them and look through the pretty substantial percentage of folks that agree that the pandemic has not only helped them to manage time better, but to balance their life more better. And we'll talk again a little bit further about how that's manifested itself and will continue to manifest itself in what people are looking for out of work-life balance. But let me flip it over to you, Steve, because I know this all kind of wells up again into that theme of where people sit in terms of optimism as we move into the new year.
Yeah, and I agree that it's really important to look at the consumer mindset. I think in a lot of ways, the question of, are we in a recession? We're in a recession if consumers think we're in a recession, because then they're going to cut back on spending, and that's going to become, a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of the macroeconomic indicators. So I do always like to look at the consumer mindset, and I think a couple of things come out very strongly when we look at kind of attitudinal measures of where consumers are at psychologically. One is a real sense of concern about where the country is going. And, when you think about, consumer optimism, a lot of times I call it, consumers have bifocal optimism, that when they're looking at things up close and personal in their life, they usually have a lot of optimism for that they have a real sense of agency and hopefulness that they're going to be able to turn lemons into lemonade, so to speak. But the flip side of this bifocal optimism is that when they look further away from their own up close and personal concerns in their life, when they look at the overall state of the country and the economy and the political situation, then there's much less optimism. And some of those measures that we look at are actually at basically all-time highs. So if we look at something like the founding fathers would be very disappointed about the condition of America today, that continues to rise to 75% of the population. Overall, the concerns about division and divisiveness in the country and in politics is very strong. The American dream has become very difficult for most people to achieve, 70%. So obviously in the press, there's a lot of discussion about economic polarization. The rich are getting richer. Look at how well the billionaires have done. The billionaires have been doing well since the 80s, basically. But even just over the last couple of years with the Corona economy, billionaires have done really, really well. And that gap between the rich and the poor in terms of assets and income has just grown stronger and stronger. I'm more worried about the American dream than ever before, 55%. That's kind of on track with what we've seen the last couple of years. I've become used to the new normal. I think I'll mention a quote a little later on where one consumer that we did some interviews with said, I want to get back to the old normal. I'm tired of the new normal. I want to get back to the old normal.
So true.
But again, thinking about that bifocal optimism with something that's up close and personal to people's lives. You see at the bottom there, 38% say young people today will be better off than their parents' generation. I mean, on the one hand, that's low. I mean, on the one hand, that's kind of always been a central tenet of the American dream, that people felt things were going to be better for the next generation than it is for them. But it has risen over the past couple of years, now up to 38%. So again, I think we see further signs of that bifocal optimism.
But I mean, some of these are good signs, right, Steve? Like the one you just mentioned, where young people today think they'll be better off than their parents' generation. Like that's up, so that's a good sign. And then I think it seems like people are less worried that, or said, I'm more worried about the American dream than ever before. That's only 55% now, right? So that's gone down a little bit, which I think is good. But there's still like the main one there, and the question I love is, around the founding fathers and would they be very disappointed with the condition of America today, and that's 75%. So we've seen a steady increase of that over the last 3 years, which is interesting.
Yeah, interesting and concerning. But
Yes.
I do think, especially among young people, among Gen Z and millennials, there is a real optimism about their lives. Again, if you go off on TikTok, if that's a reliable indicator of the pulse of the younger generation, there is a lot of optimism there. There's a lot of talk about, side gigs. I'm going to take control of my career. Yeah, big tech companies are laying off, but I'm going to be in charge of my life and my career, and I can do it. So I think kind of that spirit of the American dream of rugged individualism. You can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can will yourself to success. I think that's relatively strong and growing among young people.
There's one constant. It's definitely change, right? It's transformation and change. And on the next slide, I think we kind of touch on that with some really interesting data that we've been tracking in our barometer. And that is when we talk about whether it's this great reprioritization or a transformation, people are buying into that. You've got 82% here that agree that the pandemic has significantly changed how we live in this country. And we went a step further, actually, to try to measure where that was coming from. You can see on this next slide, next part of the slide, rather, people were kind of asked to place these different areas of their lives into whether they were becoming stronger, influences in what they wanted to do, or weaker influences. And if you look at the hierarchy on that left side where you want to be, it's about health and leisure time and vacations. And on the right side, besides distrust in government, it's less about work and career and living in cities. And you can see the fact on the bottom, 70% agreeing that since the start of the pandemic, they've been more active in finding new ways to improve their personal wellness. So that, I know, goes very much in lockstep with what we'll show you in a little bit about, again, the transformation of how people work, and to what you guys were just saying about, how people are kind of looking to take control of how they may be redefining what that American dream is. So let's kind of use that. I guess, Steve, you want to kick us into what we're looking ahead into 23?
Yeah. So we've taken a look back at where we were in 2022, and now somehow we're a month into 2023. I don't quite know how that happened. It's still I'm still one of those people who writes checks on occasion, and it's a very unnerving feeling to now write 2023 on the checks. So we've taken a look back. Now we'll take a look at the future. There's a famous quote attributed to the physicist Niels Bohr: is that prediction's very difficult, especially if it's about the future. I remember when I was a kid, I would always ask my dad, what are we going to do tonight? What are we going to do tomorrow? And my dad would always say, if I could predict the future like that, I'd be at the racetrack. So we're going to take a step into that difficult terrain of trying to project what's going to come in the year 2023. So if we go ahead to the next slide, this slide violates all my rules about how many numbers to put on a slide, but I wanted to present the full picture. So I've been doing work with QuestionPro for a number of years, and one of the things that we've tracked over time is how people feel about various aspects of their life right now and how they think it's going to change in the future. And if we measure this on a half a dozen different personal dimensions and a half a dozen different societal dimensions, trying to get at that bifocal optimism kind of idea. And if you look down in the bottom right, where we kind of average across all of these dimensions, what you see is that, basically in terms of what we think of our lives right now and what we're expecting for the future, we're about where we were a year ago. If we go back to July 2020, those first couple of columns of numbers, that was just a couple of months into the pandemic. A lot of people were thinking, oh, this will just, last a couple months and we'll just be at home watching Tiger King and baking bread and all of those kinds of things, which seem like very distant memories. Back then in July 2020, we rated our lives today as a 6.0 on a 10-point scale. And when asked about how are things going to be at the end of the year, it was a 6.8. So we really had a lot of optimism for growth. And like I said, this pandemic thing, this is just a flash in the pan. This is going to go away. And then if we look at a couple of years later, January 2022, we were at a 5.7 rating for our lives today and a 6.0 for how things were going to be in the future. So our lives today certainly had gotten worse, had gotten more troublesome, and the optimism about the future had also declined. We're still more optimistic about the future, but if you look at that again, January 2022, down there at the very bottom, 5.7 rating for today and a 6.0 for the future. That's only a jump of 0.3 compared to what we were expecting, a jump of 0.8 back in July of 2020. That if we look now at the very bottom numbers in the right-hand corner, basically today we're about where we were a year ago in terms of ratings of our lives and expectations for the future. You can see some things have jumped around a little bit more optimism about our professional lives, both today and in the future, which I think is interesting. It's easy to get caught up in headlines about tech layoffs. I think for the vast majority of Americans, that's something they follow in the news, but they don't really relate to that in a personal level. The average person in an average job is only so much influenced by big layoffs at Google and things like that. Feelings about the stock market and personal finances are down a little bit. Perceptions about race relations are up a little bit. When we'd done this before, that was kind of in the thick of protests around George Floyd and things like that. But I think overall, we're about where we were a year ago. Really, kind of a tempered optimism, I would call it.
It is interesting that people always think it's more optimistic, right? Where we are today and then where it's going to be or at the end of 2023. And even if you go back to January of 2020, in most cases, it's always up, which is, I think, a good sign. But your bifocal optimism is spot on especially when you look at the average of, personal versus societal. I mean, it's always, people say they're the hardest on themselves, but in this case, I think they're the hardest on, society and other factors going in. So it's interesting to look at that too.
Yeah, if you average all the personal dimensions, people are given ratings of 6.5 for where they are today and 6.9 where they think it's going to be. Whereas you look at the societal dimensions, it's more in the low fives. So definitely signs of the bifocal optimism there.
Yeah, I would agree.
People kind of put themselves, if everybody kind of evaluated themselves, in what percentile there'd be, everybody's in the top 50% as opposed to not, but sometimes they're not.
Fair point.
So what are they going to do? I think that's kind of interesting to see how this all manifests itself, right, Steve?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like you showed with the different ways that the pandemic has affected our lives, it's kind of increased this self-oriented focus. It's sort of increased the feeling that people have they really need to take control of their lives. They need to have agency over their lives, that they can't just be reactive to what the economy is doing as a whole, to what big companies are doing. So I do think there's a greater sense of efficacy around people's own lives. We kind of see that when we ask people about all different kinds of activities, and we ask, are you going to do more of these? Are you going to do less of these? Are you going to do the same amount? This sort of gets to notions around like New Year's resolutions and setting goals for yourself and stuff like that. And people always start off the new year with high expectations about getting in shape and eating healthy and all of those kinds of things. And a lot of times those kind of fade to the wayside as the year goes on. But we certainly see that sense of self-focus, of I'm going to take care of me and the important things in my life. When we look at what people say they're going to do more of, take care of myself, exercise, eat healthy, take active steps to reduce my stress level, I do see that as one of the kind of the big themes of the coming year. Is more and more people are talking about mental health and stress levels. And again, I see people trying to exercise a greater sense of agency around those things. So you see in the middle column there are a whole bunch of items that are shaded in blue, which just means that's the number that's larger than any of the others. But there's another way to look at these data, that if you take the people who say they're going to be doing more and subtract out the people who are doing less, that's another way to think about, what are coming trends. And you see a lot of those items in the middle that are highlighted in blue under the same amount also show signs of growth, because there's so many more people saying they're going to do more rather than do less. And again, a lot of it sort of gets to those kinds of self-care kinds of things, spend time on hobbies, get in touch with the spiritual side, get more sleep, travel for vacation, which is something that we'll talk about in a little bit. So on the one hand, it's kind of common to see these sort of metrics in expectations for the new year and that optimism around New Year's resolutions and gym memberships and all of that kind of stuff. But I do think it's, compared to what we've seen in the past, skewing more strongly in that direction of people being self-focused and trying to have agency over their own lives.
Yeah, it's interesting. Steve, what do you say to those people that don't want to volunteer for a political cause or organization? I mean, 51% say they don't do that. Are you concerned about those people, or what's that number? I mean, that's interesting.
I think there's just a sense of hopelessness that our country had just become more and more divided, that there's really been a loss of faith in the political process.
Interesting, yeah.
That's my takeaway.
I would agree.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we go on to the next slide, we take the same kind of approach to thinking about what are you going to do more of, the same amount or less of, when it comes to spending. And as you see, a lot of times you can interpret this as, well, where are people going to be doing more discretionary spending? Where do people want to be spending more? I think when we look at these metrics this year, there's also a lot of concern about inflation. So many more people say they're going to be spending more for groceries. It's not that they want to. It's not that they are, going to be spending more to be eating healthier. That's really, I think, a reflection of things that they consider out of their control, like inflation. But there are a couple items on there that I think are really interesting. Including the vacation numbers, and we'll talk more about those in a little bit. And also in terms of alcoholic beverages, we see that as kind of a growing trend, and we've got some additional data on that kind of coming up. So in terms of overall consumer spending, projections are up, but like I said, it's more about inflation overall and consumers' concerns. And then there are a couple of targeted areas where consumers are, on a discretionary basis, hoping to spend more to improve the quality of their lives.
Yeah, the number about the alcoholic beverages that you mentioned, Steve, really kind of intrigued me. And actually, on the next slide, we've got a little bit more detail on that from our January barometer data. There's been some talk, I guess, in the mainstream media about, are we seeing this era of new temperance? It's very much generational. If you look at the data here, I guess the three of us don't qualify for those that are drinking less alcoholic beverages, but maybe many of you watching us today are in those age cohorts that are not. I mean, that is a stark difference. That you see.
Mocktails are a big thing. I've seen a number of things in the press about bars that are alcohol free, and they serve interesting mocktails to try to appeal to that. I do think also that the legalization of cannabis in so many places plays a role for that, where people can still get their leisure time buzz on, for lack of a better phrase, without alcohol. There's even a phrase now, California sober, for people who don't drink alcohol but do smoke pot, and there are discussions about that in the the alcoholism treatment community. But I do think there's kind of a shift in mindset about alcohol, which is going to have huge impacts on a lot of things. If I think about a lot of the work that you do, John, around sports on television. I mean, so much of the advertising has traditionally come from alcohol companies. I think we could really see some big changes in that area this year.
It'll definitely be worth watching. Now it kind of segues into the bigger discretionary purchases, and one of the really intriguing phenomenon that we've seen, if you want to go to the next slide, we talk about inflation, we talk about people being a little more hesitant about their spending. At the same time that we're seeing that, there's almost a defiance to those conditions, in some ways maybe driven by this liberation from COVID that we've talked about over time. I was amazed to see, if you look at the data here, less than a third aren't thinking about making a discretionary purchase over the next 6 months, something significant. And that's a good sign, obviously, for those of us who are marketing products and services. And again, you kind of see here which ones kind of emerged as most significant. 36% thinking about a newer or better vehicle. You've got the dream vacation in there, and then a number of other things as well. But to me, what kind of jumped out of this was that with all that hesitance, with all of those dark clouds about the economy, that's still not necessarily keeping people away from thinking about something big. So let's talk about cars for a moment. The next, that was the vehicles, the top one there. Another thing that really seems to be very fragmented based on people's perspectives and where they are in their life stage is everything that we're hearing about the green movement and about electric vehicles. So we asked the question. We asked, if people strongly, or what their level of agreement was as to whether their next vehicle would be an electric vehicle. Here in, just like you're out in San Francisco, I'm here in New York. There just seems like every day somebody else I know is getting an EV. And, obviously when I travel to other parts of the country, that's clearly not the case, because you can see here, less than a third overall say that that's going to be their next purchase. And I'm just amazed, like even electric vehicles have become politicized, right? You've got that big gap between those that are leaning left and those that are leaning right. And also from an age standpoint, again, it makes me feel old. Okay, maybe the fact that, I am in one of those two right side bars means, I'm going to stick to my gas guzzler, maybe not. But again, amongst those under the age of 45, at least, from 25 and up, you can see a significantly higher percentage that are interested in it. So from a trend standpoint, it's definitely not going away. But there's going to be, that time period where, maybe some folks are going to stick to their guns a little bit more so than they did before. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, age under 25, that's not higher. Because when I think about, sort of the green movement and everything, I think of more of the younger generation kind of, driving that. So I'm surprised that's not, similar to like even the age 25 to 34. Maybe it's purchasing power, or they're not.
Yeah, I was going to say it's probably
that.
cost driven because, still at this point, most EVs, I mean, I found it interesting with the big announcement that Tesla was dropping prices by about $10,000, but I still think the entry price was about $50,000 for their entry level vehicle. So that may be what's driving it. Or maybe it's just that they want to travel first. That's one that really jumps out. If we go to the next slide.
Yeah, I do think also that the younger generation is just not as into cars. There's a lot of, at least anecdotal evidence of younger people not getting their driver's license as early as they used to. So much, using Uber and Lyft and all of that kind of stuff. I think the younger generation is exploring non-ownership of car-based lifestyles more than other generations have.
Wow.
Or maybe it's that they just want to take that big dream vacation, which if you look on the next slide, we've been tracking this one really shows a lot of movement. We've been tracking a number of statements about people's behaviors and perceptions and desires about both business travel as well as vacation travel. And, I think the easiest way to kind of get past all the ups and downs and peaks and valleys and the spaghetti on this chart is look to the left and look to the right and look to the numbers that, between January of last year and January of this year. Look at this precipitous increase in those that strongly agree that they're going to be taking a domestic business trip, or that they plan to take the same or more, or that vacations are a priority for themselves, or that they're going to take a major vacation. These are all up significantly from a year ago. So again, to that point about discretionary purchases, travel is that great, pursuit of freedom and experience that people seem to really be coveting. And I think there's a lot more to it, from a mental standpoint too. And on the next slide, I'm actually sharing some data from work that we do with the American Society of Travel Advisors, the travel agents and advisors in our country, where consumers are strongly agreeing about, just the rejuvenation aspects, the mental health benefits of taking a vacation. Just look at these numbers, 80% agreeing that now more than ever a vacation would do wonders for their mental health, or that they look at this as a just reward for what they've had to deal with over the last few years. So, they are certainly seeing it in pre-booking numbers, and we're seeing it in a lot of the proprietary work we do in the space. And attitudinally, just people seem to really want to have that level of escape. And I think it also goes back to how we're working, right? We talked about this. We kind of teased this at the beginning of the presentation. On the next slide, one of my favorites that we've been tracking since the beginning of the barometer. This only goes back to 21, but we've got data going back, much further than that. This charts the where people are working, and if I don't know what everybody's situation is out there, but even despite the call back to the office that we've been hearing over the last several months, you still have less than half who are working full-time every day in a dedicated space outside of their office. This isn't going away. You are seeing 52% strongly agree that the ability to work from home is something that they would certainly value from their job. So I don't think this whole hybrid situation is going anywhere. And another way that really amplifies it is on the next slide. We do some work with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where we've been tracking those who left positions during the pandemic and have not gone back. And this bar chart just blows me out, because some of the subsidies are going away. It's the economy's getting tougher. There's still this huge number of people that aren't participating in the labor force that are eligible to do so. And when you look at this, you can see that just under 50% feel that they're not going to go back to a job that doesn't allow them for a remote work opportunity. It's just only, they're strongly opposed or somewhat opposed to taking work that requires them to be full-time in an office. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I would be in that boat. The remote, I think maybe a hybrid situation, but if it was like, hey, you need to go back into the office full time, I think I would be resistant. So I kind of agree with that. And even the changing trends over time. When I first came out of school, I would say, oh, I need to go to the office every day. But, flash forward X number of years later, we don't need to mention how long. But I think, this day and age, I would say, no, it's a no-brainer that you have these trade-offs of like, I can work from home or work from wherever I want. So I'm in agreement here for sure.
Yeah, I think there's really a power struggle going on between workers and employers, and workers feel more empowered than they have been in the past to really kind of insist on a hybrid or remote situation. Whereas I think a lot of employers are really pushing hard to get people back in the office, especially among the more elite employers. The investment banks on Wall Street have made a lot of headlines about this, about, working from home is not a choice. Or I've even seen speculation, out here in California, there's so much talk, like I said, about layoffs at Google and Meta and Amazon and those places. There's some speculation that what those big companies want to do, and keep in mind, these are big companies that spend millions of dollars providing free food to their employees, because they don't want them, walking across the street to get a sandwich, let alone, work from home half the time. There's some speculation that really what they're looking to do is, cut back on costs, and they are concerned about a recession, and they want to, lay off some of those more highly paid employees. But there's a feeling that when they get around to hiring those people back, which, people in those kinds of roles, if not the exact individual people, that they're going to leverage the power they have as those elite employers to insist that people come back into the workplace. So I think there's really a power struggle going on that we're going to continue to see those dynamics play out for a few years.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see. I actually was talking with an economist friend of mine the other day, and you talk about the positioning of unemployment rates and the perception of full employment, and then there's this large percentage of people, if you look at the technical economic terms, are U6 versus U9 unemployment, those who have chosen not to participate in the workforce, and what that's done is certainly created a lot of stress on businesses in a number of categories. And in this same research for commerce, we look at that from a sector standpoint. And one area that's really continues to struggle is the service sector. Finding labor, retaining labor, getting the right kind of labor is a major issue in this area. And this next slide, I wanted to share something that we've also been watching, that is how it manifests consumer decisions and consumer behavior. And that is by showing a lot of the activities that were disrupted by the pandemic, shut down or compromised in terms of their access rules, and lost employees have not really, while they've come back and opened, they haven't necessarily opened in a way that has met the expectations or recollections of people prior to COVID. And we looked at this a lot, in particular with an eye towards some of the leisure activities, golf in particular, which thankfully for that industry wasn't as disrupted by others. And golf has experienced a pretty significant increase in participation over the last couple of years after several years of stagnation. We really believe that much of that was driven by the fact that these other activities were underwhelming. And this data has kind of shown that. That has not gone away. Here we are in January of 23, and still a third of people feel that these activities are still, they strongly agree that they're underwhelming. Another 22% agree. Those numbers have not really changed in 9 months. It looked like we were getting better, as we went through last winter into April. But these numbers are in the high, in the high to mid 30s. Pretty much consistently through the second half of 22 and into 23. So it's going to be very interesting to see how those particular sectors do staff up and do solve their issues for customer service. I know one thing that we're obviously seeing a lot of is automation, right? Again, I'll use golf as an example. A lot of places now have, digital sign-ins, and people can just show up to the first tee without necessarily stopping at the counter. That certainly streamlines the process, and there's a segment of the population that's happy to do that. But the other thing that one has to think about in those industries is high touch is pretty important sometimes in establishing a relationship and establishing a certain feeling of comfort and being taken care of, and hospitality. Where do you draw the line between the efficiencies of digital automation and the high touch needs to pamper people? That's something we're going to be looking at a lot in the year ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like when you get on the app and select your tea time, like, do you want high touch or do you not want high touch? And like, you have to like pre-select it almost, which is interesting, but I think you're right.
So I know, Steve, you wanted to share some additional things as we get near the end of our allotted time. where does this kind of lead things from an investment standpoint?
Pretty ugly in terms of the consumer outlook. So, we asked across a number of different investment classes, do you think in the year ahead it's going to be excellent, good, fair, or poor? And you see that pretty much all of the poor numbers are headed up, and across most categories, fewer consumers are saying good. There's still that, 1 in 10, maybe 2 in 10 saying it's going to be an excellent investment. But generally speaking, the consumer investment outlook is that things are going to be worse for their own finances. And one thing I think is really interesting when we ask over on the right, how do you think your investment outlook is going to change in 2023 compared to 2022? That we've got basically 60% of people saying, well, it's going to stay the same. And the other people, the other 40% basically are split, where a bunch of people are saying, I'm going to be more conservative. But we've got basically just as many saying this is a buying opportunity. I'm going to be more aggressive. So I think that's going to lead to more volatility than usual. And obviously, it's been a rough year for the stock market. There are a lot of baby boomers who are getting close to retirement, and they check in with their financial advisor, and their financial advisor's telling them, well, generally, as you get close to retirement, we recommend that people get more conservative and look at bonds and money markets. But I think a lot of those baby boomers are now basically being told, hey, your portfolio is down. You're going to have to get more aggressive with your investment choices if you're going to make that up by the time you hit retirement. So
yeah, it's an interesting climate. We asked a similar question in the last barometer about, if we kind of posed it where if people had a large sum of money to invest and they had to hold it in that investment for the year ahead. And similar to what you have here, the plurality responses, I think, were in equities or in actually savings accounts. So, a real split between those that are kind of hiding the money under the mattress and those that are going to continue to ride out the overall progression of equities.
Yeah,
it's interesting. And even here with, crypto, you can see in, Jan of 2022, if you look at the poor line, it was 20%. And this year it's, 40%, which obviously, with everything going on with FTX and the crypto markets and things, it's interesting that aligns with kind of the current economic trends as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of skepticism about crypto because of the things you mentioned, and it's generating all kinds of headlines. And I think, consumers were much more confident that was the next big thing, and now some think it's the next big thing. Some think it's going to zero. So it'll be interesting.
Somewhere between tulip bulbs and technology, right?
Yeah. Tulip bulbs, nice. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, the last thing that I wanted to share is we do have a number of open ends in our surveys, and I just picked out one in particular where we ask consumers on that personal level, how do you think 2023 is going to be different for you personally? And as you look at the most common words that are used, I tried to do this with Chat GPT, and every time I went there, it said our resources and our servers are full. So I had to go to an old-fashioned word cloud generator. But you see, more and better and hope and a lot of relatively optimistic kinds of terms. But then if you look at the
It looks like we had some technical difficulties here. I think we just got dropped. I will get things going here. Oops. Hey, John, it looks like we had a little technical difficulties here. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay.
But let me
back
here.
Okay.
I'll share this. Hopefully Steve will come back. But I know Steve was talking about, how will 2023 be different for you personally? And you kind of see some things here with, more, better, or, I think 2023 will be different for me personally because I've decided to live my life better, which means, being more active, more present with my family, eating healthier. And I think that goes back to some of the things that we saw before in some of the trends where, people are more focused on their, personal health and wellness.
Yeah, it definitely seems consistent with a lot of what we've been talking about today, right? You got at the same time that people are being a little more cautious and are certainly keeping a keener focus on what is happening economically, they're still trying to get theirs. And
Yep.
part of doing that is to live, a life rich of experiences and hopefully live a life of a little bit more purpose when it comes to wellness.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Back, we were just talking a little bit more about how some of these comments are really in lockstep with some of those dichotomous forces of financial skepticism, but not if it means sacrificing, living your best personal life.
Yeah, I think I dropped off there for a second. I think big commerce and the deep state didn't like me talking about consumers
It
living
happened to
more
all.
simple lives and having
Yeah,
side gigs. So,
yeah. I think it happened to all of us, Steve. So we got dropped there for a minute. So they didn't
okay.
like it. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think the deep state was listening for sure.
Yeah.
So
Trying to censor us. We
yeah.
got canceled there for about 30 seconds.
Oh, that's what it feels like. All right, no. Interesting. So, anything else to add here, Steve? I mean, a lot of it was around, you know, seemed to be around getting healthier and making those healthy choices and personal wellness. But any other,
Yeah.
did anything else come to mind when as you were reviewing this?
I think just living simpler lives, more travel, more experiences. We've said for 10 years or 20 years that people are more interested in experiences rather than things. And I think now we're at a point where their
Mm,
spending is really going to reflect that in a way that we
hmm.
haven't seen. And then what I didn't show here is this question shows responses for how do you think 2023 is going to be different for you personally?
Mm,
We also asked, how do you think it's going to be different for the country? And it was very negative, expecting
mm,
much more dysfunction and divisiveness among our political institutions. There's a lot of concern about geopolitics, about
hmm.
Ukraine. Um, that whole notion of bifocal optimism came out really, really strongly.
Interesting. Interesting. I could see that. And that seems to be a trend year after year, right? Of like it seems to be people have that bifocal optimism. So that is the best way to put it.
Hmm.
I know we have a couple questions come in here, and one of them, I'll just ask them here. We have a list going from all the different sources. One of the things that someone asked was, looking for updated stats on shopping trends. Has COVID forever changed the way consumers shop? Is it, via brick and mortar or digital? Or John, have you done anything there in your barometer around sort of the way that consumers are shopping and shopping trends at all? Or
Yeah, we've looked at it, I think, more on a case by case basis. I think we were always kind of moving pretty aggressively towards digital options even before the pandemic. And I think the pandemic only further accelerated that. As always, I don't see it obliterating the retail experience because there are still certain, particularly high consideration items that people want to touch and feel. And, we talked about, the whole aspect of creating an entertainment aspect around certain elements of shopping. So I
Mhm.
still believe that that has a place and will have a place in certain categories, but we're certainly not ever going to go back to the days of 90% of people shopping in malls as we may have thought about as we got into the 80s.
Interesting. Interesting. It makes sense. Yeah. I remember going to the mall, and I think that's kind of seems to be done now. So,
Yeah, malls do
interesting.
seem a thing of the past. I'd be curious to see. I haven't seen this, but some updated numbers on the extent to which people are online grocery shopping. Because with the
Hmm.
pandemic, that had a huge burst in growth, and I'd be curious
Yep.
to know if that has settled back.
Yeah, we
You know,
did a little bit. I mean, this is certainly not reflective of grocery shopping as a whole. We actually were looking at it for one of our spirit clients in the spirits industry about delivery of alcoholic beverages, and it did, obviously increase rapidly during the pandemic, and it has settled back a little bit in the last one that we looked at. It's still there, but it not to the extent that it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, my car was recently in the shop, and I thought, oh, I've got to put in an online order for groceries, and I thought, wow, I haven't done this since I was watching Tiger King and baking bread in the heart of, that I
Well,
like
they found Carol Baskin's husband, so maybe that's not as.
Oh, geez. If you had Tiger King on the bingo card for this webinar, I think you're the winner. We had a question from Rebecca come up here. Are there any particular trends you're seeing specifically for the coming summer?
We're seeing international travel start to bounce back, and that's always been a pretty popular time period for that. So I think, again, with all things, if all things remain relatively constant from an economic standpoint and from a public health standpoint, this looks to be a summer that is going to see a substantial amount of increased travel into Europe in particular as things open up even more so across the globe.
Interesting. See, did we ask about that at all in our survey around summer travel? I don't know that we did, but
I don't think we had anything specifically on summer travel. I agree with John. I think international travel is going to be big. I do also think that the return of the Great American Road Trip might come back as a way for some families to come together. And then, there have been some high profile stories about, the difficulties with air travel and the Southwest Airlines meltdown. I think that as people seek to have more control over their experiences, that the idea of a road trip might be more appealing. I also see more and more out there in the press. This is anecdotal, but around van life.
Van life is a real thing. Yeah.
Yes, that young people are increasingly exploring. I could see that being increasingly popular among a certain niche.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I think the road travel and getting out, road trips and things. If I'm any indication, like during the pandemic, we got an RV, we got a truck, and we hit the road, and that's what we've been doing. So, and I think once you do it, you find it's actually pretty refreshing. So that's a total side note and anecdotal to no end, but I definitely agree with your statement there. Great. Well, I know, we're at time here. There were some other questions that came in. So like last year, maybe we'll do another round to this and just, do a 30-minute kind of Q&A where we answer these questions. I do want to, thank everyone for joining, John and Steve. Thanks, you guys. Really appreciate it. If you want to, if you want to reach out to John, Steve, or myself, here's our information. So feel free to hit us up on LinkedIn or email us, and we'd be more than happy to answer your questions or get back to you on anything that we maybe didn't cover today that you had questions on. Feel free to reach out to us. We will do a part 2 and a Q&A, so be on the lookout for that as well. So with that, John and Steve, thanks guys, appreciate it.
Thanks, always fun. Glad to be
here.
Hope people enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks so much.